Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Technology. Technology is such a lousy word, you know? I mean, downright shitty. People use it to mean so many different things, and they use it so superficially, too. Like, as many historians of technology will tell you from their experiences teaching in the classroom, a lot of times people say technology, but they just mean smartphones. In a recent post on the Peoples and Things newsletter titled In the Shadow of Technology, with technology in quotation marks, I build on the thoughts of the great historian David Edgerton and others about why we scholars of technology studies need to be so careful with the word technology. In fact, I go so far as to agree with Edgerton that as analysts, probably we should just avoid using this term in our analyses, except for when the people who we are studying use the term as an actors category. Except, I still have never found an elegant replacement for it. And so I find that I still have to use it, at least to get a foot in the door. Kind of like the finger pointing at the moon. But once my foot is in the door, what I tell people often, you may have heard me say something like this before, that what really interests me is the material dimensions of human and non-human life. How critters rearrange the world to pursue their ends, and the consequences these rearrangements have for the critters who made them, for other critters, and for the world at large. But boy, that was a mouthful, wasn't it? But at least for me, and I struggle to put why this is the case into words, but there's something about thinking in this materialist way that very quickly takes me back to very ancient times, to human prehistory. You could say in a kind of Darwinian fashion that I am interested in the natural history of, well, technology, the natural history of technology. But as I've pointed out in previous episodes, maybe especially the one with archaeologist Catherine Freeman, that so much writing about technology, in quotation marks, very much including, by the way, the field known as the history of technology, is focused on very recent time. And as we've talked about also on this show, recent time in a geographically constrained area, namely mostly the United States and Europe. There's lots of problems with this, but one big umbrella set of problems is that considering only limited examples in this way leads us to make false generalizations about the natural history of the material dimensions of human and non-human animals and the consequences thereof. You see why I sometimes find the word technology indispensable, even for all of its rank, stank shittiness. But in my social world, in my scholarly orbit, no one has done more to point out these problems and to work to rectify them than the great historian Pamela Long. And that's why I'm so excited to share this conversation with her, with you. I truly am. Pam is a MacArthur Genius Prize winning thinker and a deep and impressive scholar. We used her soon-to-be-released book, Technology in Mediterranean and European Lands, 600 to 1600, as an excuse to get together and chat, but we talked through the trajectory of her career, her other great books, including Engineering the Eternal City and Openness, Secrecy, Authorship, and we also discussed some very neat projects she has coming down the pipe. One of them, a history of sumptuary laws, and it sounds like the history of the relationship between those laws and material change, I am just in love with and cannot wait for. So much excitement about studying human and non-human life with technology. And that's why I say to you, hey, get excited! so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
There's so many things I want to talk about, but why don't we start with your book, Engineering the Eternal City, Infrastructure, Topography, and the Culture of Knowledge in Late 16th-Century Rome. If you explain that book to strangers, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with it?
Well, that's a book that took 20 years to write, and I actually loved writing it. I never thought I would finish it. It involved burying myself in the many Roman archives. And what I wanted to do is create a picture of Rome in a 30-year period. And the reason for the narrow period is I could get into all the details, the arguments among patrons and the papacy and the city of Rome. And it's about the infrastructure of Rome, building bridges, cleaning streets, the dirt on the streets. And it's also about the mapping of Rome. So it's about people on the ground and how they actually did these things, or how they decided or argued about who would fix a bridge, which they did argue about those kinds of things all the time, and how they tried to get the streets clean, but very often obviously failed. And how they reconstructed aqueducts as well. That kind of engineering infrastructure problems that are problems every day today in every city. I just tried to show how they were problems in the late 16th century. And, usually Rome is idolized as this wonderful, shining marble city.
Yeah.
And you don't think, well, there was, actually shit on the streets.
Yeah, exactly. No, you don't have to worry about language here, my friend. All language welcome. Yeah, I mean, well, that's funny. Was I gonna bring up manure of feces with you? I probably was, because I remember when you gave, I think maybe the Da Vinci Prize. This is the Lifetime Achievement Award in the Society for the History of Technology. Maybe it was that talk, but you talked about smells and how the streets would have been very smelly, and you thought people probably just had a different relationship to smell during that period than we would today. Something like that.
Yeah, I definitely think so. For one thing, we have the germ theory of disease. So, and they did not. They had a theory of disease called miasma, in which smells were what made you ill. So if they smelled, but then also they did not have a modern system of sewerage.
Right.
So there was often sewage of people, but also it was a society entirely driven by animals. So there were tons of horse shit on the and oxen, and the things that on the streets. And so and they dumped it into the river. So in the river and on the riverbanks. And there are there's a law, for example, that people that cart sewage to the riverbanks and to the river must clean the banks once a year. So that tells you, so you can infer that there were piles of sewage on the banks of the Tiber River.
Wow. And so how'd you get into this history and this period? I mean, how did the project kind of define itself? Yeah.
Well, I had previously worked on sort of artisanal writings, and Vitruvius was an ancient architect who wrote the only fully extant treatise on architecture in the ancient world, and it was very much about theory and practice. So I worked a lot on those kinds of subjects. And then I went to Rome I had been to Rome as a tourist briefly, but I went to Rome in 1999 thinking, oh, maybe I'll write a book on obelisks, because there was a wonderful treatise on moving the Vatican obelisk from a corner to the center of the square of St. Peter's. And that's how I started, and it gradually evolved. So when I first went there, I had a reference, and I got up my nerve to go to the archive and present myself, and with my then like pretty bad Italian, horrible Italian, I would say. And anyway, I got in. I got the they're called buste. They're large leather books of documents that are put together in the book, sewed together in the book. And I opened it to the page, and I couldn't read it at all. It was like horrible. And so I started tracing letters, and gradually, I did learn to I learned to read Roman notarial paleography by teaching myself. Like, oh, this means that. This scribble means that. Anyway, but it gradually expanded. The whole time I wrote the book, I changed the subject and I moved it around. And in fact, I changed a lot of things around, like 1 month before the final thing was due. So it was
Right.
it was a continuous process. And I just saw, partly dependent on what I found, but I found these wonderful things, arguments over a bridge, how to repair a bridge, and who owed the money. And there were continuous arguments between the city council, the Capitoline Council of Rome, which was the traditional body that governed the city, and the papacy and their bureaucracy. And that conflict was great because it produced written records in a way. So that's what I found.
That's nice. And one of the things we talked about while you were working on it is just all the maintenance work going on, but also not going on. I remember one of your points in one of our conversations was that a lot of things were not being maintained very well during this time that you could see in records, right?
Yeah, the thing is that there wasn't a modern bureaucracy, so you didn't have. You did have laws, and there's one document from the 1550s that gives hundreds of fines to different people for throwing their sewage on the street and
Okay.
not maintaining the space in front of their palace or building, whether the space was paved or not. And that tells you that. And there weren't, we have in every city, however well maintained in North America, we have paid workers that clean the streets,
Yeah.
I believe. And we have a modern sewage system. So
Yeah.
people, there is a problem with dogs, I know, but people, we have toilets, etc. And they did not. They had chamber pots, and they sometimes had sewage pipes that go out of the house and just dumped into the street. And so that wasn't. They had the idea that they should have clean streets, but it wasn't consistent, and the bureaucracy was not in place to really do that. And that's true of all pre-modern societies, I think.
So I wanted to go back and think and learn how you kind of got into this work you do. I think you identify as are you a late medievalist, early modern person? How do you identify as a historian? And when you entered grad school, did you know you were going to focus on technology right away?
Well, I would call myself a late medieval, early modern. I don't, periodization is really difficult, and
Yeah.
I've always had trouble with it, and I've always tried to avoid it. So I don't call myself a Renaissance historian
Uh-huh.
because that's sort of a loaded term, and many
Yes.
people do, and it's fine. I don't call myself an early modernist because that's a loaded term too.
Yeah.
Everything is loaded.
Yes. Yeah.
It's like, and so that's why at the end of I call it late 16th-century Rome, because I think that's like as neutral as you can get,
Yeah, it's
and
very
very
specific.
deliberate. Um, in graduate school, no, I didn't identify as anything. I started this work on when I went back to graduate school, I was a social worker for 7 years, and then
Okay.
I went back to graduate school. And what I did want to do is do earlier work than I had before. and I loved the earlier work. And I also wanted to do something that had to do with art history and paintings. And so I minored, as they called it, in art history. And I took a lot of art history courses, which I had never done before. And I got into the Vitruvian tradition. And so I wrote I have to say, really bad dissertation, which fortunately was never published, but because I didn't have I wasn't good at interpreting. But I did read all the 16th century Vitruvian commentaries, and Vitruvius is about, it's about building, and it has a whole chapter on machines, and it has a chapter on astronomical instruments and hydraulic things. So, and at that time, which was quite a long time ago, there was the idea that technology was secret and science was open, and that just showed wait a minute. But this is technology. This is all about machines, and it's written, and there are 70 medieval manuscripts of this or more. And wait a minute. But I didn't do that. I mean, I worked on a lot of ancient and medieval stuff, but I really got into 16th century commentaries. And the 16th century is the first time there are extant Vitruvian commentaries. So that's why I got into the 16th century. But I've always been very broad. I mean, I recently completed a book called Technology in Mediterranean and European Lands 600 to 1600, which is not yet published, but is now in press, thank goodness. So I work on a lot of medieval things too.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of, study of ancient stuff, but that doesn't mean I'm a specialist in those things.
Well, how did you think when you were going through grad school, how did you think of it, like your home field? Were you like a European historian, or just how did you kind of self-identify?
I mean, I guess I thought I was a European historian.
Yeah.
Well, at that time it was called Renaissance Reformation.
Okay.
So I probably thought I was. I mean, I don't remember what I thought.
Yeah.
Did I think anything? I don't know.
Well, there's that. That's the classic question. Did you end up going like meetings of the Society for the History of Technology quickly, or did that only come with time as you were working through these things?
No, I went to my first meeting was at the Smithsonian, so I was here in Washington, and I don't remember when it was, but it was a very early meeting. And actually, I have to say the reason I was drawn to the Society for the History of Technology first, because I've always been very interdisciplinary as a matter of disposition. So I could have gone to any group, and I am a member of too many different societies.
Yeah, sure.
It's a problem because they're relevant to me. But the thing about that meeting, I was very shy. I think I've gotten over that, but I didn't talk to anybody. But people came up and talked to me, and they were actually interested. They thought what I was doing was interesting, and to me that meant everything.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my.
There's a place for me.
These are nice people. They think what I'm doing is interesting. I mean, that really was important.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And I think we should all keep that in mind as we go to SHOT and other meetings, and we know all our friends, but there are these people we don't know that, so. Anyway.
Yeah. Pam, apparently you didn't get the memo, but the history of technology begins with choo-choo trains and then goes on from there, right?
Oh, really? Oh.
I wanted to talk to you about, I feel like you've been, one of your roles in the field of the history of technology is calling us back to these earlier things and trying to remind us of these changes. And so, talk about that, being like a historian of earlier times than like what gets the vast majority of attention in the field.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for one thing, earlier times are just so much more interesting. Come on, you guys. I mean, don't you understand this? It is so fascinating to be back there in the 16th century or the 12th century.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because it's different from us. And and because we can't put our assumptions. I mean, every person has assumptions about how things are, and then if you go back before the to another culture than our times, you realize that, well, no, things aren't that way. They are some other way. So um, that's why. So, what was your question? How did I get back there?
Well, no, it's just I think of one of your
Oh,
roles is like calling people back, right, and saying like
right,
there is
right, right.
technology actually in 600.
Right. Right, that's right, because, actually, if you think about it, the early history of technology was very, uh, I mean, Lynn White was a medievalist.
Right.
The founders did this early stuff, and there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
And then gradually the field has drifted to, very much, you know, modern 18th and 19th and even just 20th. I've been to shop meetings. I mean, I hate to say which was mostly 20th century.
Yeah.
And I think I don't understand it, but I've always fought it vigorously,
Yes, you
not
have.
that
That's yeah.
successfully.
Yeah, yeah. Well, somebody's got to be out there saying it. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's even in some ways it's even worse because I think the tail that wags the dog is like history of computing these days, which is late
Yeah,
20th to into
yeah,
21st century.
yeah.
So
Well, I mean, I think part of it is STS, which I have nothing against
yeah,
STS. I'm a historian, not an STS person.
right.
But they claim to have a historical element, and they do, but they are very reluctant to go back past, I mean,
Yeah,
the
this
19th century,
yeah,
before the 19th century, because in fact, their interests are more modern interests, I
yeah,
think.
right. And so the other thing I was going to bring up is just I think when you see it in your forthcoming book on European and medieval or and Mediterranean technology in Mediterranean and European lands 600 to 1600, which you already mentioned, um, is archaeology, right? This kind of evidence is important for doing this kind of thinking.
It's totally important. I mean, and in this new book, which I just loved, it was very hard to write, but I loved writing it, and I tried to emphasize. Uh, I mean, so I don't read Turkish or Arabic, but there's a lot of work now in those in the Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. There's a lot of new work that's more accessible in the European languages that
Uh-huh.
I do read, and including primary sources, and that work is very important. Getting primary
Yeah.
sources into different languages and there are also just wonderful scholars who do know those languages that are working. But so I try to emphasize as much Eastern Mediterranean and North Africa as Europe, and that
Yeah.
made it very hard because there's huge
Right.
scholarship for all of that stuff.
Right.
And yeah. So what was the question? I forget.
No,
I
it's
lost
okay.
track.
Uh, so I actually wanted to turn to the new book now and say I had a couple questions for you. So I mean, like with the again, this is technology in Mediterranean and European lands, 600 to 1600. What are the biggest lessons you want people to take away? The book's kind of organized by technology type, but when you thought about like what is the like what are the kind of big arguments of the book that you want people to hang on to?
Well, I mean, one of the big arguments is that it's extremely important to look local. That if I mean, my imagination is such, and it is a historian's imagination, to imagine a single farmer or a single um, person grinding grain, and what they need to do to stay alive, basically, and what are the resources that they bring to bear, and what are the technologies that they use. So I think, economic history is fine. I'm not trying to oppose myself to a whole field. I just think what I'm doing is different, and maybe we need both. So the whole idea of progress, I don't, that's not my guideline, because progress for whom? Like, what are you really talking about? You might talk about more production of food, but then where does the food go and what's happening in that production? So it's very important to me to try to understand individuals and individual societies, towns, people, but then towns and regions on their own terms, not on some, theoretical terms or terms of so-called progress, which always turns out to be European superiority,
Right.
basically.
Yeah.
And and so that's one thing. Another guideline, or it turned out to be a guideline. I just plunged into this, so then I came out with something which, but is that I just don't think, heuristically speaking, the idea of revolution is useful, because what it does is it's an unbelievable number of revolutions that happened in there's the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages, the print revolution, the military revolution, the green revolution, and I could name like 15 revolutions. And after a while, people love technological revolutions.
Yes, they
And
do.
after a while, heuristically meaning it doesn't allow for a sophisticated interpretation often, because not that all the people that have created all these revolutions, all the historians weren't good historians, and not that we didn't get much from them, but the fact is that if you're talking about a revolution, you're going to ignore the way that innovation is intertwined with traditional technologies,
Yeah.
and that's what has always been done.
Right.
And so, so I try, and my book is not just about technologies, but it's also about it's also historiographical, in the sense that the major historiographical themes of past technology, of past historians, in other words, the reader could be somebody that really doesn't know this field at all, and so I tell them, I inform as I go along and give my own, interpretations, but what the past historiography has been.
Right, right. Um, and uh, we're going to get into that in a little while. I want to talk to you about mills, of course, one of my favorite topics. But so we'll do a little bit of the historiographical dance on that one. But a couple other questions. You already kind of got into this, I think, by talking about Africa and kind of the Eastern Mediterranean. But one thing I've learned from reading about kind of the Mediterranean during the antiquity and the medieval period, well, at least the early medieval period, is that, that area of Europe, when we think, I think especially when Americans think about Europe, they often think about Western Europe, and it's kind of like a Western directed thing. But during this earlier period, Europe was really Eastern looking and oriented towards, all kinds of areas in the East, actually. And so do you see that? I mean, you kind of already hinted at it, so I guess you're seeing it. But do you see that when you look at this kind of technology survey?
Well, yeah, definitely. I mean, for one thing, well, the Perrin thesis divided Europe, the Mediterranean, into East and West, and found that there was a break, and that has been vigorously disputed by all these many on the ground historians, and it's just not true. There was always great interchange between the Eastern Mediterranean and the West. And of course, the Eastern Mediterranean was more urbanized for a long time. And the other thing that's important is that even though I have a fairly restricted region, it was a huge region, but it's also in a global context. And the Indian Ocean trade was so important long before. I mean, and so that actually is a huge influence on the world that I was talking about, and I try to make that point as well.
So
You
as
know,
you
when I
go ahead.
can I give an
Yeah,
example?
yeah, please do.
When I was a graduate student, I took a class on oh, what was it? History of architecture, Renaissance architecture. And this was like the standard thing that Brunelleschi's dome in Florence is a double shell dome and it has herringbone structure of bricks so that it could go up self-supporting. And um, and he was portrayed as this total genius who got this idea out of his head and built this monument. And that's the way it was presented. And then decades later, I find that in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Byzantine Empire, and then the Arab, there were double shell domes everywhere, and it's like, oh, really? And
Uh-huh.
they're on every ship that went, and there were thousands of ships that went from, say, Venice to Istanbul and other regions, Basra, different. Um, there were carpenters on every ship. There had to be carpenters.
Sure.
So not only were they there, sitting there, but there was this, and there were colonies of, Europeans, Italians, and other. I mean, European is a little anachronistic, but
Right.
Italian, Venetians, and other Genoese people that lived over there.
Sure.
So don't tell me they didn't notice how to make a dome. I mean, come on.
Yeah. It's just that's amazing example of kind of like European chauvinism or something.
Yeah, yeah. But
Yeah,
it's because of the sort of isolation of the modern discipline from,
yeah,
and that's really changing, and not only my own work, but lots of people's work now.
that's
Yeah.
right. And so I don't often ask this question, but the work you did for this book is unique and neat. And so I just wondered, like, you were reading about these new areas and learning, as you kind of like outlined, like in European languages you can read, you were reading about these places you didn't know much about yet. So I just wondered, like, what were some of the things you learned about that you most enjoyed kind of learning about during this project?
Um, well, I loved reading, oh dear, now I'm gonna have
Don't worry about
trouble
names.
with names.
Don't worry about that.
Oh dear. Oh no. Um, uh, I love reading the recent work on archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean. There's wonderful stuff, and there's now a survey. It's an archaeological survey, which is an archaeological method of taking a huge region like 500 square miles, and they do aerial surveys, and then they figure out. And there's new archaeological work that I just loved learning about. I loved reading these books about the archaeology of certain agricultural sites, or milling, and sort of the irrigation of North Africa, which is so different from it because the geological and hydrological
Oh,
uh,
I see. Hmm.
um, conditions are so different. So, and then some of the I mean, I think the most important translation for me is this wonderful um, a treatise in Arabic that is now available in a English translation, very good edition, and it's a description of Fayum, and Fayum is this region that is about 30 miles from Cairo, and it's in the desert, but it's a completely developed region. And I mean, it's not completely developed. It's villages. There are 120 villages. In the 12th century, there were 120 villages, and it's not an oasis because it's actually irrigated from the Nile, but through long canals, and there are all kinds of. Each village has a certain water right, and they had water wheels, and they had local people people in the village managed the water in their village, and there was no, I mean, as contra the Wittfogel thesis, there was no central government telling them what to do about how to arrange the water. And there's this wonderful description of every single village and who was there, how many people, what they were. Each one was described by. Each one was governed by a particular Berber tribe,
Uh-huh.
and so which tribe, which didn't mean much to me, but and what they did, and some of this, and whether it had a mosque or how many mosques and how many people. It's this wonderful on the ground description. And so this spring, I went there to Fayum and got a tour guide from Fayum who's actually getting his master's degree in waterworks of Fayum.
Okay.
Took me and my husband around the whole. It was just wonderful.
Oh, that sounds
But anyway,
wonderful.
that's why I wanted to go there, because I had read this wonderful.
Hmm.
It was a report
Uh-huh.
basically for a sultan, but anyway.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And could you see traces of the water management that you'd read about? Like,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
there were
yeah.
actually there were working water wheel. Of course, a water wheel is first of all, it's a huge structure, much
Uh-huh.
larger than many people think of it. There were these huge, what we would call norias, 3 together. They make this loud but beautiful sound. They sing, actually, which
Wow.
we don't really know,
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
many of us don't walk by a noria every day. And a noria, that any big water wheel has to be repaired every year.
Uh-huh.
You
Uh-huh.
can't. I mean it. So, but they were. So they're not. I wouldn't. They're not. It's not medieval wood you're looking at.
Right.
But it's a medieval water wheel,
Uh-huh.
a noria, and the irrigation there was very similar to what is described. So there are. Individual people have fields, and they have a certain allotment of water, and they have little canals along their field, and they have an hour of water a day. So then when their hour's up, they put a little dam on their little canal, and the water turns to the next person. And it was just amazing. We walked through these fields and saw all this. It was quite amazing. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway.
That's so cool. I love it. That's a great example. And a great example of this locality, right? I mean, you could take a
Yeah.
kind of, if you wanted to kind of do deep history, you could take a kind of ecological perspective on humans as animals and say they end up with very different traditions, and they do very different things depending on their environment, what they have
Yeah.
to do to make a living in their locality, right?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, some of the stuff I read about irrigation in the sort of in the more desert areas of North Africa, where they have wadis, and wadis are they're the name of places, but what they are like dry, almost dry riverbeds, and there are huge floods there,
Uh-huh.
but only occasionally, and the rest of the time it's dry. So their whole irrigation is capturing that water when it comes, preventing damage, controlling it, and saving it for,
Yeah.
agriculture. That's completely different than anything in say, Munich.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right. Was this one of those examples where we have examples like this in Latin America, where there's almost like a kind of divot where when it floods, it kind of fills up like a pond or something? Is it that kind of
well,
thing?
they have cisterns,
Okay.
and they have canals, and they
Mhm.
have multiple ways of saving the water, and they have kind of fields that let the water sink in, and so that can become something you can plant because it has enough water.
So I have a chat with a couple historian of technology friends, a text chat thing, and it's basically like the mill fan club. We're really into mills.
Oh, oh, nice.
And
I
there's
love
like
meals.
there's a number of mills just down the road from me here in Virginia, old mill buildings still standing. And so I was of course very interested in your section on mills in the book. And this was one of those I wanted to get a bit into the historiography here because I thought this was a really nice example of this kind of dance you're doing of talking about how historians have written about these things, but then what, like kind of the state of the knowledge around about these things
Yeah,
these days, right?
yeah,
And you talk about so there's for listeners who are not historians, there's a famous historian, one of the most famous historians, Marc Bloch, a French historian, who was related to what becomes known as the Annales School, and it seems like if I get this right, apologies if I didn't, but the Annales School kind of suggested that the Romans had not really acted on mills like as aggressively or as powerfully as they could have, right? Because they valued other values or something like that. And it sounds like where this is not where kind of with archaeological stuff and other kind of things we've learned since then, that's not right, right? So can you tell us a bit about that, just as an example of kind of how historians have thought about things and how stories shift over time?
yeah. Um, well, I mean, Mark Bloch was one of the great historians of all time.
Right.
In my opinion, he was the greatest historian of the 20th century. But he and the Annales School, his idea was that uh, let me see. Wait, I'm getting confused. Well, the idea was that the ancient Romans did have mills, but that the idea was they didn't really care about their mills, or they didn't develop them because they had slavery, and this wasn't just Mark Bloch. It was there was broad agreement about this, and so then you can talk about the Industrial Revolution of the Middle Ages because the medieval period did develop mills extensively, and heavy, overshot and undershot water mills. They're talking about more than horizontal mills or other kinds of mills. They're talking about water wheel mills that are overshot or undershot. So, but then since then, um, first of all, there have been many more archaeological discoveries that show that actually the ancient Romans did develop their mills, and so that really, and that argument is also the case with heavy plows and with harnessing of animals, because the whole medieval industrial revolution was that they developed the heavy plow,
Yeah.
around, and then the stirrup thing, but
Right.
the harnessing, and now people that do this wonderful, detailed research show that. I mean, this one scholar went around to all the museums in Europe and found little evidences of plows, and because mostly they're saved in museums, gathering dust,
Okay.
sometimes in storage. Nobody looks at them,
Uh-huh.
and he really showed that there was a whole development from antiquity of the heavy plow, that it wasn't just, boom, a whatever 11th century
Yes.
and
Revolution.
a revolution, right? Right,
Yeah.
and the same is true of harnessing. The whole
Uh-huh.
idea that the ancient Romans had harnesses that choked their horses. First of all, that's a little silly, isn't it?
Yeah,
I
I would
mean,
think.
would the ancient Romans really have
Are they
had
that
harnesses that
stupid? I don't think
choked?
we're any smarter than they were, frankly. So,
But anyway, I mean, there were improvements in
sure,
harnessing,
sure.
but it was more a gradual development.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the stirrup thing, and that's kind of a nice example because it still comes up. Sometimes in my writing, I beat up on this essay by Arizona State University President Michael Crow and Daniel Sarowitz on nanotechnology, but they just kind of like used the Lynn White stirrup story like straightforward as if it was
really,
real. It's like from
really,
2000 too. I mean, they
oh
had
my
no
goodness,
excuse. But
yeah,
so
yeah,
there is this famous, I don't know, but probably Lynn White didn't even create it, but there's this famous thesis that the stirrup gets introduced and just radically changes everything, right? It
Yeah,
changes war.
it created feudalism.
Right.
Right. The stirrup created feudalism.
Yeah, so where are
It
we?
is Lynn White's thesis. Yeah.
Okay. I just didn't know. I thought maybe I've read his essay, but I couldn't remember if he was drawing on, like a European historian or whatever. But where are we at on that now? I mean, like, this must have be debunked like a million different ways since then, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, military historians have taken that thesis and shredded it into little pieces, and there is none of it left.
Yeah.
But the thing about, and again, Lynn White was a great historian. He brought history of technology to America, basically.
Right.
And his work is often wrong, but very provocative, and has created all this research. So I don't want to, he's one of the giants that we stand, the
That's
shoulders
right.
of which we stand on. But no, I mean that the stirrup, the thing is that little book, so Technology and Social Change or whatever the
Right.
title is, it's still being assigned, I think, and which is fine in a way, but it's not fine because it's so not correct.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
but it's such an accessible, it's a little book. People, and in our modern culture, people love technology, but they love technology as sort of the solution to everything. It's going to change everything. And we don't have to worry about our horrible political situation because technology will, or the climate situation, because technology will save us. And, the only problem with that is it's not true. What will save us is if we ever got our political act together globally, which, makes things much more pessimistic, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's why people who aren't historians love, they still, Lynn White, and some people who are historians, who aren't historians of technology,
Yeah.
they just love that. So they can't hang on to it.
Oh, the stirrup story is very seductive from several different kinds of angles. It's very attractive. So, yeah. So I wondered, I really liked your point about kind of setting aside progress and really looking at the local. But you're also a person who, the new books from 600 to 1600. I wondered if you work on the early modern period. I wondered if you have like your own take on what shifts a bit later, right? I mean, I hate the Industrial Revolution term. It's terrible. But there is, in the 19th century, for instance, you see a lot of productivity, or, like just kind of productive output grows very fast by all kinds of measures, right? And so as someone who is kind of looks at this earlier period, do you have a take on what you think is like what drives that later shift, or do you just like leave that up to the mass production people or whatever?
Well, I mean, I do think I don't say there's not change.
Yeah, I hear
think
you.
it's important it's important to talk about change and innovation. And I think one thing that happens, let's not even talking about the 19th century, but there's this huge, from the 14th century, there's this huge increase in productivity of artisanal objects and materials and things. And there's this huge growth of consumerism. And there's this sort of rise of commerce that allows ordinary people to buy stuff or get more stuff. And it's not a modern situation in that there's still gift exchange is still very important. And as Martha Howell has pointed out, you can't put 19th century ideas onto this. You shouldn't, because it's a distortion. But right now I'm doing some translating I have two translating companions, Chiara Baraviera and Bill North, and we're perfectly we fit each other perfectly in the sense of being perfectly coordinated to be translators. And we're translating Roman sumptuary laws right now that we have is going to be published in West 86, which is a decorative arts journal.
Oh, cool. Cool.
And so
Sumptuary
I'm
laws are like limiting who can wear nice clothes and things like then have
right. It's
luxuries,
all
right?
about like women can wear these kinds of sleeves, but they must not have sleeves with slashes or made with gold and not just
Yeah.
women, but women who have been married for 2 years or men who are of a certain. It's all very. And these governments of Europe were, I mean, they put out like hundreds of these sumptuary laws. They were very like concerned with sleeves and
Yeah.
bodices and tights, and both men and women. But as the 16th century went on, more women than men. But the reason for them has to do with a different view of the relationship of clothing to the person, but also because now some poor shopkeeper could dress like a noble, and
Right.
it sort of undermined the hierarchy of
Yeah.
things. And
Yeah, so you have this technological change going on, which is allowing shifting
right,
prices and stuff, and they can dress differently, but then that ends up creating friction with the kind of social
right,
hierarchy, right?
exactly. But back to your point, the
Yeah.
changes is a huge development of consumption and
Yeah.
production. I mean, this happens in the 14th, 15th, and 16th
Right.
century.
Right.
So I don't know about the quote unquote industrial revolution,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I
but
think this is happening. I haven't read very deeply into it, but there's a new project coming out of the UK that just had a big publication recently that's showing, and I think it was covered in like newspapers like the Guardian, but showing that like the kind of home industrial output shift
uh,
in the UK, which some all these things are terrible, but it's like the proto-industrial revolution or whatever, right? That starts in like it was really going very strongly by the 16th century. They just keep pushing it back
yeah,
using really
yeah,
strong sources. So I think that you're right. I mean, this is one thing that we can do even if we want to think about the industrial revolution. It turns out that there's these late medieval, early modern changes that are a part of it that we
yeah.
can miss
I
very
mean,
easily.
on the one hand, you don't want to put modern stuff back on
Yeah,
that, but
exactly.
on the other hand, you don't want to think of the Industrial Revolution as something entirely new, because it really isn't.
Right.
And so there's a middle way here
Yeah.
where um, you can. And I mean, it really is a problem that I guess there has to be disciplines. And some people work on the 19th century and some people work on the 14th century.
Yes.
But and you have to, because it's so difficult to just master the sources in what you're working on. But you also have to look up and look around, I think. And that's the value of, I mean, I do both very specific archival work, but also I think it's important to do syntheses, because
Yes.
you have to look around and then you help other people look around.
Totally. I've been thinking about this a lot recently is the value of kind of creative syntheses. And sometimes I think we don't do them enough. I'm very excited. I mean, I think it will be interesting to see. David Edgerton's working on a global history of production right now. And I don't know where he starts it, but, he's been tearing the Industrial Revolution and other such terms a new one for years. So, I mean, I know that, he's very focused on the localities again, where like Detroit and these places where mass production takes off. But his point is that it's not like industrial culture spreading everywhere. It's very highly centralized in localities and always has been. And so that I can't remember where he's starting things, but yeah, it'll be a nice synthetic picture.
Yeah.
So what are you up to? So you're working on a couple translations. You got the new book coming out. We've been talking about. What else are you up to? You always have so many things going on. So,
I know. Well, unfortunately, I was writing 4 books at one time,
oh my lord.
which was a mistake,
Uh-huh.
but I couldn't help it. It was not my fault. It was, but now this one book is in press with Hopkins,
Oh, cool.
and so I'm working on 3. Basically, what are 3 books? One is, and some of them are collaborative. One is a history of the construction of the Gesù, which is an enormous church, a Jesuit church, the first Jesuit church in
Okay.
the middle of Rome. And while I was working on engineering the Eternal City, I found this wonderful in the Jesuit archive in Rome. I mean, wonderful detailed account book of the construction with all the
Wow.
stone, the horses and the loaders and the carters and the stone carvers and the muratori, which are the bricklayers and the masons, and I couldn't deal with it. I couldn't. I mean, it would have taken me like 25 more years to write
Yeah.
the book, but now architectural historian Ann Hupert, who teaches at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I are writing a book on building construction where that document, which is a big it's like 245 pages,
Okay.
is the core of
Nice.
the work. So that's one book.
Yeah.
It's going to be about it's not architectural history or, which is often centered on big architects,
Yeah.
famous architects and design,
Uh-huh.
but it's how they actually built the building. Like,
Yes.
how did they build the foundations? And I
Yes.
think we can do that from.
Well, work is
And
a big theme in this is a big part of your perspective in general, I think.
yeah, I think so. So that's book number 1.
Yeah.
Okay, book number 2. It is which I've been playing with for decades, but now I'm just writing a book. It'll take me a long time to write it, but it's called The Lure of the Machine, and it starts with a comparison of Leonardo da Vinci's Madrid Codex 1, which is all about elements of machines, and Francesco di Giorgio, who was an engineer in the late 15th century and who wrote treatises that include a lot about machines, including drawings. And then it'll end in the early 17th century with Vittorio Zonca, who wrote these what are called theaters of machines. And so that's book number 2.
Hold on, what's a theater of machine?
They were these wonderful, usually big books that had huge pictures of all kinds
Okay.
of complicated machines.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's the famous ones are Agostino Romelli and Jacques Besson, and Vittorio Zonca is one. And then there were many others that are not so well known.
Got it.
But for some reason, people started talking about machines and drawing pictures of them and sort of inventing things as they drew, which you don't always know whether it's just in the picture or are they copying a machine that they're seeing, or is this an invention or what? Anyway, it's a very interesting development. And I think it's important in the sort of, I was referring to the how people look to technology as a solution to everything. I think this is an important point where that starts, where they just like technology, and technology means power, and so these beautiful books were given to rulers, and that means I'm like, I am,
Yeah.
And anyway, that's the second book. And then the third book is the translation, my 2 colleagues that I referred to, after we finish the sumptuary law translation, which is due at the end of May. Oh my God. Sumptuary law, I mean, it's hard to translate because you have all these technical terms about clothing that are just, but anyway, then we have a contract with Italica Press to do, and our translations are highly annotated, so it's not just translating, but it's annotation. The urban laws of Rome, so all those laws about, and papal bulls, but also laws of the masters of the streets about street cleaning and about reconstruction and about bridges. And there's all this material that I would say is untranslated, and even historians that work on Rome, papal bulls are the Latin is very turgid and hard to penetrate, and it's both mostly Latin and Italian materials, a lot of Latin materials that will just be available to people that don't even read Latin and Italian. So, and will be useful not only for people working in Rome, but people working in anything
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
environmental history or infrastructure, things like that. So,
That's wonderful. It's funny, that last one got me thinking about, I can't remember. It was something I've been working on, kind of like these critics of technology in the mid to late 20th century, like a Lull and Winner and all these characters, right? And they've defined technology in such a way that it really only starts in the 20th century or something like that, right? Often. And and there's this question, it's post, I mean, for Winner and other folks, it's like this post new left concern with technocracy. So it's always like, are we going to be able to democratically steer this thing? As if regulation is also some kind of late development. I wish I could remember what text I was looking at when I was having these thoughts. But anyway, one of the things I was just like, okay, so why don't we talk about all the rules that existed in like colonial America about chimneys,
yeah.
uh, and all
Right,
construction.
right,
And so
right.
your book will be extremely helpful for me, because I'm always I always think about like, you also see building regulations in like the Talmud about safety and stuff
Yeah,
like that, right? There's always been regulations around
yeah,
risk and these kinds of
yeah.
things, and so I think that your text will be very helpful for reminding
Well, I
people.
mean, I do think one of the differences between modern times and, um, say, the 16th century Rome is that, we do have, we have like Washington, D.C., we have hundreds of regulations, but we also have employees that carry sanitation
Yeah, yeah,
employees
yeah,
and
yeah.
people. So there is more control. Of course, there's also more, there's just as much getting around the
Sure,
regulations
sure.
as there always was. But I think the regulations in the 16th century were probably particularly ineffective because, they were, because they keep generating the same
Yeah,
regulations over the
right.
2 centuries. You can just read, like, you have to keep your street in front of your palace clean, and then they just do that over and over
Yeah,
again.
50
So
years later, they're still
obviously,
saying it.
obviously, this is not working.
Yeah, and part of your explanation, if I mean, you've said it a couple different ways, a couple different times, but it sounds like an absence of like the state and state employees who are doing that work is part of the explanation.
Or I wouldn't say the state,
Yeah,
but I mean, but I would say, there's not a modern infrastructure bureaucracy in
yeah, okay,
place.
okay,
Like, you don't have employees who are paid wages to go around and collect
got
garbage.
it.
I mean, you do, sometimes you do. If
Right.
like Julius III in the 1550s has a little part where he says these people are going to be paid to collect sewage, but then he dies, and a
Mhm.
new pope comes along, and that is clearly not being carried out anymore.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. How fascinating. Well, Pam, thank you so much. And thank you for all the work you've done, reminding us that technology started before choo-choo trains, actually, and that we should look at these earlier moments and learn about them, because they're fascinating. So thank you very much for taking the time today.
thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed this thoroughly.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com, or by following me on Twitter at STS_news, or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.